Okay, good afternoon. My name's Al Rosenblum. I'm a pastor and a teacher and a counselor. Uh, discuss marriage. We're in a marriage series. The title of the marriage series is Using Conflict to Become Collaborators. Most of us are afraid of conflict and we avoid it at all costs, thinking that somehow it's going to hurt us or it's going to hurt our relationship with others. But it's the opposite of that. Conflict is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to see ourselves as we operate. It's our opportunity to see where we're being selfish, or maybe even our partners being selfish. It's an opportunity to see these things that are in us that are not healthy for relationships so that we can change it. And it's an opportunity to use God's grace, his promises, to be able to maybe endure something or to change something or to grow into something, to be gracious, to express love. Many, many wonderful things come out of conflict. Conflict is necessary. In fact, it's a great gift. So instead of being afraid of it, we need to learn to embrace it and use it for that which God intended. Okay. So we're in this marriage discussion. We're talking about submission because it's a big issue in marriage and it's a difficult issue. It's difficult, has been difficult for me to understand why God requires it of a woman who marries a man, and what is she's to be submissive. What does that mean? What does that really look like from the Bible's perspective? And how do we apply that in today's life, especially in this culture, if that's even possible? I've come to believe that we don't really understand what the idea is. So the next two sessions, especially, I'm hoping will be helpful. All right, in the first lesson, we looked at the core problem in marriage, which is selfishness. God's solution is for us to develop humility, to become other-centered instead of self-centered. And we view our mate as a work in progress. Nobody has arrived. We do a lot of counseling, my wife and I. We talk to many married couples, and invariably, every one of these couples, male or female, expects their partner to be able to fulfill the biblical mandate at some high level, even though they don't see that for themselves. If my husband would just be like Christ, then maybe I would be submissive. And the truth of the matter is that's not true. Submission has nothing to do with the husband. It really isn't about the husband. It's about God. All submission from the husband or the wife is to God. It's always to God. It's not to the husband. Okay. The second lesson, we talked about submission in just a general sense in the whole Bible. Submission to God is the framework in which God offers man blessings, and it's within that framework that we can receive his blessings. There is no blessing outside of the will of God. If you're not under God's authority, purposely in his will, then whatever God is sending to you, the blessings that he would want, and I'm thinking in a positive sense, the only blessings you're going to get outside of God's will are the conflicts and the difficulties that you encounter in the devil's world, which are designed to turn you back around and push you back toward God. So this was our second lesson. So our third lesson, which is today, we're going to get into the introduction. There's going to be two lessons, at least, on submission in marriage for the wife. It's a complex idea. Hopefully I'll be able to explain it. I think I'm starting to understand it. All right, but here's our introduction for it. So first of all, every work of the Godhead, the creation, the work of Christ, the work of the Spirit, our salvation, the growth of the believer after salvation, and the roles assigned to different believers within the church, these different aspects of life, all of these different roles and positions serve as visual aids of God's essence and God's plan. I've come to realize that God is huge. Everything's a visual aid. Animal sacrifice in the Old Testament was a visual aid of the work of Christ. The animal was Christ, and he's killed, sacrificed for the sake of the sins of the Jews. So he's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. It's a visual aid. So when you get to the question of why does the wife have to be submissive? What's up with that? Why is that? Well, women are just as talented, even more so, stronger than men for sure, smart, capable, all the things that any human being would want to be, but yet they're assigned this role. One of the reasons, at least, is because God is asking her, actually giving her the opportunity to play out a role in the drama of human life, of being the church as it responds and submits to Christ. In Christian marriage, the husband represents Christ and the wife represents the creation, and the image portrayed, when it's done properly with mature believers, is of God loving the creation, his desire for a relationship with all creatures. He wants all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Christian marriage, when it's done properly, creates that image. And it's for humans to see, and it's for the fallen angels to see, maybe even the elect angels. It's a visual aid. That's all it is. It has nothing to do with the value of women. It's not about keeping women pushed down or toxic masculinity or any of that nonsense. It's about a visual aid that a wife submits to the Lord by taking this role and plays out the cooperative, helpful, the easer, the helper, that role in the relationship, so that she can create this image of the church as in relation to Christ. Okay, it's that simple. And only when you come to love the Lord, ladies, will you be willing to do that. Really take that role. Some women are naturally that way. Submissive types, easygoing. They like the background. They don't like to be out in front. They don't like to be in control. But when women are operating, when they're healthy and operating out of their femininity, they're open and inviting and nourishing. That's their nature. And they're not trying to control. When a woman gets hurt, though, and shuts down, she begins to try to take control. She can no longer trust God or the husband, so she has to make sure that her and her kids are going to be taken care of. She does it herself. And that's when women become controlling. So, all right. In Ephesians chapter 2, 1-6, we see mankind, we start off in verse 1-3 with the human race in a status of spiritual death, dominated by the devil, dominated by our sinful desires. Then in verse 4, it says, but God, and he talks about being, we're saved by grace and not of works, not of ourselves, lest any man should boast. So he talks about the grace salvation and our position in Christ. Okay. And then in verse 7, he says, in order that. So he's talked about our spiritual death, our salvation, our union with Christ, the indwelling of the Spirit, all of these things. Why did God do that? He's going to tell us for this purpose. And he says, in the ages to come, that's all eternity, he might show. And that word show is the word indictmene, which means to teach by illustration. For all eternity, God is making us illustrations of the surpassing riches of his grace. How does he make us those visual aids? It says by his kindness toward us in Christ. Our mission as saved people is to receive the kindness of God. And in eternity, he will make us a visual aid of all that his grace was able to produce in us and through us. All right. So his purpose for saving us is for us to be visual aids of grace for eternity. Visual aids, that's God's program. Secondly, God's purpose for assigning different roles for husband and wife in Christian marriage is to create a visual aid portraying Christ in the church, like we said. This is Ephesians chapter 5, verse 32. Now, starting in verse 22, Ephesians 5:22, he begins to tell the wife, be submissive to your husband. Then he says to the husband, love your wife like Christ loved the church. And he talks about how Christ, in his sacrificial love, is going to grow us up spiritually and present us as mature believers to his Father. All right, that's at the judgment seat of Christ. And what you learn is that the husband's love for his wife, Christian husband, Christian wife, is to help her grow spiritually. Everything that he does, every love act that he performs is with this in mind. Does that help my wife grow spiritually? Does that help her come closer to the Lord? Is this good for her? Is this beneficial to her? Am I helping her? Am I hurting her? Am I giving to her or being selfish? That's the question he asks. So he plays out the role of Christ and she plays the role of the church. Now, in Ephesians 5, like we're talking about, he starts with verse 22, and then he gets into how the husband is really the nurturer in the relationship. He nurtures her. So he's going along in this discussion of marriage, describing the wife, describing the husband, and then he stops right in the middle of it. And he says, but really, what I'm talking about is Christ in the church. He's really discussing what Paul was discussing in this whole, his real goal was not to discuss marriage, although he did. He's discussing how Christian marriage, when done properly, submissive wife, loving husband, it creates this image. And he says, in reality, what I'm talking about is the mystery, it's a mystery doctrine of the church age, is the mystery of Christ in the church. That's where we get the idea that Christian marriage is a visual aid of Christ in the church. So while male and females are designed with human differences that fit into the marital roles, the woman's called a weaker vessel, and this has to do with her body. The vessel is the body. The soul's in the vessel, the body. So the primary goal of assigning the wife a submissive role is as a visual aid of the church, as it surrenders to the Lord. The wife's submission has nothing to do with ability, intelligence, or any other human quality or situation. Okay? Nothing to do with that at all. God is offering the wife an opportunity to be blessed, to grow into this submissive person. See, that's who we're to be with God anyway. Submitting in your marriage, which is really to God anyway. See, the husband is not the object of submission. God is. It's through him. It's easy when a husband acts up, which they all do. None of them are perfect, and many of them, most of them are not mature. They don't know how to love. They try to lead with too much hands-on. They try to be in charge and try to be in control. They try to be the authority when they're never told to be the authority. They're told they are the authority, but not to be the authority. So they try to be the authority over their wife, and they end up trying to push her around, violate her freedom. Because see, submission is addressed to the wife. It's not addressed to all women. It's addressed to a wife in relation to her husband. It's her issue. It's not his issue. If my wife doesn't submit to the Lord through me, that's none of my business. You know, I have to live with it. I have to be patient with it. I have to love her in spite of that. But that's her choice. It's her command and her choice, not mine. So I just stay out of that. I didn't always do that, and it messed us all up. Now I just stay out of her business. She will live her life as unto the Lord. And if she figures out how to do this the proper way and does it, you know, in surrender and obedience to the Lord, she will be praised for it. So thirdly, so submission in marriage and love in marriage from the husband is a visual aid. the point. All believers are required to submit to God's authority and in the roles that he assigns us. Okay? Everybody deals with this in life. In Christian marriage, both the husband and wife are required to submit to God to perform their assigned task. The husband submits to God by loving his wife like Christ loves him. This is the obedience of unconditional love to her. It comes from God to me, and I pass that on to her. That's my submission. You know, I submit to God so that even if I don't feel like it, or even if things aren't good, I go back to this: what is love? How is love expressed? What is love in this particular situation on this particular day? And I'm commanded to implement that, to express that. That's my submission. The wife submits to God by submitting to her husband. And listen, by the time this lesson and the next lesson is over, I'm hoping that we understand submission in a whole new way. Very, very different. Okay. So she cooperates and supports what's going on. All right. The family is on a family mission for the Lord. So she lets the husband leave, and she cooperates and contributes and discusses and confronts when it's necessary. She gives the best that she has to the situation, and works with her husband to accomplish the family mission. Thirdly, the wife submits to God by submitting to her husband in all things to cooperate and support her husband. A Christian marriage that is operating by God's design is lived by faith in the Word of God. All right. And that is that both husband and wife are to submit to God for their particular roles and responsibilities. The whole thing is a submission to God. Whenever it's not, then it's not working right. Okay. And when a husband is sinfully off base or involved in evil, you just, ladies, you just peacefully and quietly tell him, no, you're not involved in that. All submission, whether from the believer, the husband, the wife, is within the framework of God's will. All legitimate godly submission is within the framework of God's will. If someone asks you, a boss, a policeman, a court official, a government official, a husband, a teacher, a coach, ask you to do something outside of God, clearly not God's will, something unrighteous, something sinful or wrong, you're not required to do that. You don't do that. You peacefully and quietly, ladies, say, no, I'm not doing that. Okay? That resolves the issue of the concern that every woman I've talked to about this immediately goes to the exceptions. Well, what if? What if he wants this? What if he says that? If it's not sinful, if it's not evil, then you go along with him. You're trusting the Lord for it. If it's sinful or wrong, you just say, no, you're not doing that. Okay. The idea that the wife has to submit to her husband, and he gets to be in charge, or he gets to abuse her because she's not there yet. She's not perfected at this yet. He becomes impatient, or he thinks that by throwing his weight around, raising his voice, trying to exercise some form of authority is going to create a positive reaction, or result in his wife. That's just not going to happen. That's abuse. See, there's no need for that. That he has no right or no divine mandate to act in that manner. All right. So that's immaturity and selfishness. And that is a part of life. So nobody, when they get married, as a rule, is mature in marriage. You have to be married for a while. Marriage requires a huge learning curve. It's a big curve. Not everybody succeeds at it. less now than in the past. But, all you can do is your part. That's how marriage works. Uh, it's an individual role that you're to fulfill in submission to the Lord. And your partner has to do their part. And if one or the other fails to do their part, usually, unless it goes completely off the rails, one partner can keep things from moving in a positive way. And this is important, especially when there's children. But if one partner goes off and has an affair, commits adultery, gets involved in drugs or something illegal, or becomes really hurtful and abusive within the home, then usually the marriage won't continue. Okay. All right. So, and nobody, by the idea of submission, ladies, is encouraging you to stay in something that is truly harmful to you. And of course, you've got to make that decision, and you've got to decide whether you're going to take what he does and use it as a reason to leave, if it's not really a reason to leave. People make excuses. People make excuses for themselves. And you have to decide between you and the Lord whether this has reached that point where it's no longer, or it's reached a point where it's possibly very dangerous to you or your kids. Then you get out, or at least you leave and make distance and bring in the authorities, bring in a pastor, counselor, or somebody that can mediate this. All right. Now, let's talk about failure, because failure happens all the time in marriage, especially men, okay, and women. But God is perfect. His delegated authority in your life is always for your blessing. Authority is for blessing. It's for protection, and it's the framework through which the blessings come. But when humans inhabit positions of delegated authority, there will always be overreach, there will be abuse, there will be mistakes, there will be failures, there will be behaviors that cause hurt and pain to those under them. I don't think it's avoidable. Very, very few people ever enter into marriage, have children, raise a family without something hurtful going on, because we're sinners, and we're just immature, and we're selfish, and we struggle, and we make wrong choices, and we get upset, and we say things we shouldn't say or even don't mean, and all of this goes on. If not for forgiveness, people think it's romance and love that makes marriage work. That's not true at all. That's what gets you together. It's like a trick of nature. But what makes marriage work is forgiveness. When forgiveness stops, everything stops, because you no longer open your heart back up. Something happens and you're hurt, and so you shut down. If you don't open your heart back up to that other person and let them start over with you, then the marriage ends right there. I mean, you may go through the motions, but the relationship, the intimacy in the relationship comes to an end. Simple as that. Forgiveness, forgiveness is not reconciliation, but forgiveness lets them off the hook for their sins and their failures, because Christ paid for it and lets us off the hook eternally. Now, from there, you work on reconciling and putting things back together, rebuilding some trust, some consistency, that type of thing. But if there's no forgiveness, there's no relationship. Same with God. If you fail to come and confess your sins, recognize that you've been wrong and you've been out in the toolies, pursuing some worldly goal, and you've been away from God. When you come back, he wants you to admit that to him and be honest with him. And of course, the sins are already paid, but then in a parental sense, he has to forgive you to restore you to fellowship. It's the same in any kind of relationship. So, all right, when those in power and authority use their power selfishly, trying to control, punish, or manipulate those under them, their failures create lasting damage to those they hurt. You hurt little kids, that your own children, and they are years getting over there. They'll be adults before they're able to really overcome that. I listened to Johnny Depp talk this morning on his trial. He's in some crazy trial suing Amber Heard for money over defamation or something. And he was talking about his own father, how his father left, and he was very angry with his father and very upset, felt betrayed, and felt like his father was weak. And he said later on, my dad really explained what had gone on. He said, I realized I did not have the full perspective of it, and I was able to forgive him. So that's forgiveness, all right? But the hurt that we cause those under us, when you're in authority, that's an important thing to know, understand. Try to avoid. A woman designed to be open. A woman is designed to be open and inviting. That's her soul, that's Nakiba. That's the Hebrew word Nakiba. It means open. It means inviting. It means in the Greek word, it means nourishing. So she's open to the man, and she's inviting him into relationship, not only mentally, emotionally, but physically. And she closes around and nourishes. That's her nature. When a woman's healthy, that's what her heart will be like. Okay. But when she gets hurt, she becomes tempted to close off her heart and put up walls. And she lives behind protected walls against this man because you hurt me. I'm not opening back up to you again. So there's no forgiveness. There's no reopening the heart. There's just going through the motions of being married, having kids together, doing finance together, whatever it happens to be. So she has to open her heart back up to become inviting and nurturing again, the way God made her to be. All right. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, it talks about David's failures as a husband, as a father, his abuse of power as a king. He's a great example of letting his power. He went crazy for a while and abused his power, killed Uriah the Hittite, took his wife and made her his wife. Of course, God caused the baby to die. He neglected his own children, and Amnon raped his other daughter Tamar and destroyed her. Then her brother Absalom killed Amnon. He was the oldest. He was the one in line. And so craziness. This is what all resulted from David's sinfulness, his abuse of authority. All right, fifthly, the failure of a man to operate properly in the exercise of authority or in his submission to it, to his boss, to the police, it does not change God's establishment of it, nor does it give us an excuse not to honor it. Just because, ladies, and we're talking about your submission in marriage, we've not defined that yet, but we will. And you're going to be surprised about what it is. But the fact that God established this, even though he abuses it or messes it up or does the wrong thing with it, doesn't change the fact that it's there, that God expects you to deal with it and to submit to it, even if the one who's exercising it in your life, who's in that position, is not worthy of it. See, your submission is not to a man, a human being, it's to God. It serves God's purposes, whether it serves your husband's or your purposes or not. It serves God's purposes. And I realize as you're listening to this and you're going, I hear what you're saying, Al, but forget about it. I'm not opening myself up to that. Too many failures, too many hurts, too many pains. Well, that's your choice, but that's between you and the Lord. See, your submission in marriage is to the Lord. So what you're saying is you're not going to submit to the Lord. It has nothing to do with this man in your life. It's to the Lord. See, all right. So we all have a temptation and tendency to use the unfairness in our life, or what we perceive as unfairness, and the pain we feel from it, as an excuse to not do what we know and believe God wants us to do. The pain in my life from the unfair things that have happened and the difficulties and all that's happened becomes an excuse, a justification not to do what I need to do. It gives me an excuse to goof off or to feel sorry for myself, to go into self-pity. And therefore I tell myself I don't have to do what I need to do. I don't have to obey God. Our experiences with unfair or harsh authority lead us to anger, resentment, self-pity. It tempts us to reject the position of authority because of the person in that position. So you got to see through the person and honor the position, because God established the position. If you can't honor the person over you, then trust that God has a purpose for that position, and trust that he has a purpose for that person being in that position. It's trusting God. Your submission is to God. People often say they would submit to the person in authority if they would apply it fairly. It's not true. I would submit if he would love me like Christ. The wife's submission is unconditional to God. See, there are no conditions. It doesn't say submit to the position of husband in your marriage if he's fair, if he's good, if he's kind. It doesn't say that at all. And when we get to Peter, what Peter says about it is very important, because he puts it in the context of unfair treatment. The husband says, I would love her if she would respect me. See, the husband's submission to God to love his wife is not conditioned on what his wife does or doesn't do. These are straight out commands. Unconditional submission and obedience is what God requires. Number 6, all submission is to God. I've said it 100 times, I'll say it 100 more. It's always about God. And he will never require any of us to obey a command to do something contrary to his will. That's just not in the cards. That is not the plan, for you to do something that's not his will. The question always arises in this particular discussion: what if my husband asks me to do something wrong? Wants me to rob a bank, participate in some kind of sexual sin, stop practicing my faith, stop going to church, etc., etc. What should a woman do? Well, are those righteous things? Are those things in the will of God? Then don't do them. If they're not within the will of God, don't do them. Don't submit to that. If your husband tells you that you can't go to church anymore, some men preachers I've heard say, well, you shouldn't go to church anymore. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's what the Bible's teaching. You may end up divorced over that. But see, the Lord comes before him. He's more important than him. And you may be able to find some middle ground or work something out. But it's completely out of line for him to require that of you. But the goal of submission, ladies, this is very important, is to win the husband. Your submission to God, your trust in God, and your revealing and demonstration of your peacefulness when your soul's at rest because you're trusting the Lord, then that's what submission. See, you're submitting to God to trust him for this situation. And so you just surrender and you're peaceful and you don't fight. You just do what you're commanded to do. You don't forsake the assembling of yourselves as you are commanded in Hebrews 10:25. But you're not obstinate about it. You don't argue about it. You're peaceful and quiet because you're at rest in the Lord. See, that's submission. And that's what wins the man. You show him your faith in the Lord without words, Peter says, without words. You don't preach, you don't finger wag, you don't get on to him. You don't say, well, that's just wrong, blah, 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 and become argumentative. That's not submission. That's you trying to control the situation. I know this is going to fly in the face of some people. Well, I can't help that. I'm trying to teach the biblical concept because it's all over. You can't avoid it. You can't escape it. If you're going to be biblical, if you're going to live your life by the Bible, you can't get away from this. So we need to understand what it means and why God requires it. So the Christian wife submits to the dictates of her husband by gently and quietly telling him, no, I'm not going to do that. And in doing so, she demonstrates her faith, her trust, her surrender to the will of God. I'm not doing that because I'm submitting to God. I'm going to do what God says. And that's it. You don't go on and preach a sermon or tell him how sinful he is or how evil he is or how wrong he is. You just don't go along with it. You just quietly and gently. But see, your whole mission is to win him to the Lord, to be saved, to follow the word. You're trying to win him to the Lord. And that's a whole different thing than you're just simply trying to resist doing something that you don't want to do. Very different. Submission in of a Christian wife who's in the will of God is refusing. It refuses to do unrighteous, sinful things. But the reason is to express your faith in the will of God, the promises of God, the character of God, to be at rest in him, so that whatever happens, you're at rest. This was Sarah. See, she was at rest. And that's the inner beauty that shines through that the husband sees, and it wins into the Lord. Okay? All right. Sarah submitted to Abraham's wish by trusting the Lord in a situation in which she had few options, if any. Abimelech took her. Abraham let it happen. What did she do? She didn't fight. Abraham had asked her to do this. She just said, okay, I'm with you, Lord. Take care of me. I trust you for it. She was at rest. She didn't fight. She didn't struggle. She didn't argue. She trusted the Lord. And that became submission. She submitted and surrendered to the Lord. That is submission. Okay, it's not obeying, this overreaching, dominating man. Husband, love your wife is not to dominate your wife. It's not a dominating position. So it's not giving in to being dominated. That's craziness. That's the world's idea of authority. All right. It's surrendering to the Lord and trusting the Lord so that you have a peaceful and tranquil heart. That's the inner beauty. That's where it comes from. All right. Abraham's fear caused cowardice to not trust the Lord for his own protection. Simple as that. I mean, who was in charge of Abraham's protection? The Lord, not Sarah. So Sarah's trust and rest in the Lord allowed her to trust him for whatever happened to her. And listen, that made Abraham a non-issue. Okay? She submitted to the Lord. All right. In Ephesians 5:21, which reads, submit to one another in the fear of Christ, in reverence for Christ, submitting to one another. And some teach that both husband and wife are to equally submit to one another. All right, and be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. Let's think about what this means when the Bible talks about submitting to one another. First of all, the concept of mutual submission, which is what this is called, is connected to the command in verse 18, chapter 5, verse 18, to be filled with the Spirit. So this is a present passive imperative to allow the Spirit to be the controlling influence in your life. And that's what the idea is. You're in the Spirit, you're empowered by the Spirit, you're surrendered to the Spirit. So that's submission to the Spirit. So when that happens, Paul lists 5 different aspects or characteristics that are generally produced by the filling ministry of the Spirit. And this is, he's describing, I believe, what happens in worship, because he talks about singing, speaking hymns and spiritual truths to one another, singing and singing psalms in your heart to the Lord, being grateful to the Lord for all. He says, be grateful for all things at all times. And then the 5th thing he said is submitting to one another in the fear of the Lord. So the idea for every believer to be humble and open, to be influenced by other believers, by their wisdom and their gift, is what submitting to one another is about. So if someone comes to me, in my distant past, many, many years ago, I had decided that I was going to make a decision, and it was a publicly known decision. But I knew in my heart something wasn't right about it. And one person in that church that I was in saw that. They were able to discern that this person had the gift of exhortation. And that person's still in my life. But this person confronted me after church one day and said, why are you doing this? What has caused you to make this choice? Your heart does not seem to be in that. And it was the perfect thing. And I realized that the Lord was speaking to me through this person. And so I put down all my walls and I opened my heart and I listened carefully and allowed this person's viewpoint, because it was the Lord speaking, to influence me. I submitted to this person's spiritual gift and their wisdom. That's submitting to one another. Okay? That's very important when it comes to understanding what the wife's submission to her husband is. All right. So the idea is for every believer to be humble and open, to be influenced by the wisdom and spiritual gift of other believers. You're open to allow God to speak through others. In my church, that's very much the case. Many of us are very healthy in that way, and we're willing to hear when another believer gives good counsel. All right. So the concept of allowing God to influence you by speaking through another believer is transferred to Christian wives in relation to their husband. In that passage in Ephesians 5:21, this mutual submission, he gives the word hupotasso, which is this military word to submit. In verse 22, the very next verse, and he says, wives, as unto your husbands as unto the Lord. He doesn't even give the verb. He borrows the verb from the verse above, submit to one another. He borrows that idea of submitting to one another and applies it to the wife. What does that mean? That means that the wife is to receive influence, to be willing to be influenced by the husband the way she is willing to be influenced by other believers in the church who are ministering to her. The husband is a minister to her to provide leadership, to provide love. God uses him for guidance in her life. When he's out of fellowship, if he's suggesting something wrong or sinful, that's not from the Lord. You don't submit to that. Pure and simple. Don't even question if it's not. Now, you say, well, who's to decide whether it's from the Lord or not? I think that we're supposed to go this way instead of that way. Well, that's not the prerogative. That is the husband's prerogative. You know, like Sarah, you submit to the Lord for whatever these decisions bring about. You quit looking at circumstances and quit trying to be in control of it, and you surrender yourself to the Lord and trust Him to guide the husband, to correct the husband, to lead the husband back around, to lead your family back around, or whatever the situation is. You don't look at circumstances. All right. So if a Christian wife thinks her husband is wrong, but he's not advocating sin or evil, she trusts the Lord for the circumstances. Oh no, I think this is a bad move. Who knows what it's going to do to us? Who knows what it's going to do to the kids? You have no idea what it's going to do. Just because you think it's a wrong move or the lesser move, you have no idea what God has waiting on you at the end of that decision. Trust Him for it. Trust Him for it. You know, there's no reason to confront your husband and to cut the heart out of him because you won't cooperate. And that's what happens when a woman wants to confront every decision and has to have a voice in every decision. It's fine to have a voice. It's wonderful to have a voice. Women are very wise and smart, but part of this system that God has created is she is wise. And if she is wise, she is careful to build him and to encourage him and to nurture him up instead of down. So now, what is true mutual submission? Here's what I think. The Christian wife submits to God and to His word by submitting to her husband's leadership. The husband submits to God and His word by sacrificially loving his wife like Christ loves the church. Both roles are under the authority and leadership of Christ and are fulfilled by submitting to God's authority. That's how it works. All right. And then we're going to do another lesson and get deep in the passages. And we're going to see the most wonderful benefit that comes to the family when a wife understands what submission is. Most of us fear conflict because we believe that having disagreements with our loved ones, or even people in general, might cause them to be angry with us, to think less of us. We might even lose the relationship in which the conflict is occurring. So we avoid it by suppressing our differences, pretending to agree, and we go along to get along. This is what happens every day. When we deal with conflict in this way, where our frustrations are never voiced, we become resentful and angry with the other people involved because we're not getting a fair shake. The other person is dominating. It could be the man, it could be the wife. You know, women who are shut down and closed are very controlled. So they'll control their husband in a lot of ways. So in the conflicts that occur are used by either one of them to win the conflict instead of winning the person. Biggest mistake a woman who's in this role with a husband, I think, can make, or not the biggest, but a big mistake is to fight to win the argument, to be right. I'm right. And I'm going to make sure that my opinion is pushed out hard. She's trying to win the argument rather than win her husband. So rather than win him to the Lord, she's trying to win the argument. And there's no blessing in that. There's no benefit for anyone in that. It's just ego stuff. You know, it's just fear. You know, and this is man or woman. We can control comes from fear of being hurt, you know, fear of not getting what you want, you know, so you try to control the situation rather than open up and trust God for it and trust your partner to work their deal out with the Lord. So when we're afraid to stand up for ourselves, though, see, this is another type of fear. When we won't stand up for ourselves in our everyday life, then people take advantage of us. Even more, we're never truly honest about what we think and how we feel. Most people don't even know how they feel. They have suppressed their emotions so completely that they're numb. They don't know what they feel. They just have adopted these behavior traits, these behavior patterns that allow them to get along and with the least amount of conflict in their life. That is an awful way to live. Terrible way. All right. Without good boundaries, our relationships will be unhealthy. They'll be lopsided, absent the mutual respect required for a relationship to grow. But when we are willing to be honest about what we think, what we feel, what is my perspective about the differences that we have with our partner, with our mate, when they first become apparent, when a conflict comes up and you realize that you're not getting a fair shake, this person is dominating. If you don't speak up and allow the conflict to occur before you become frustrated and resentful, then what will happen, it will spiral into something bigger. You'll just suppress it and just grit your teeth and go on and think, well, I'll just live with this. And then it gets worse and worse and bitterness sets in. It's always better to confront things up front before there's an issue, before you really have resentment about it, before you build up negative emotion about it. You know, if things aren't going equitably, fairly, you just go, hey, you know, let's work this out in a better way. You confront, you use confrontation to find a middle ground between the two of you. You use it to find this middle ground and become collaborators. Now you're in it together, and each of you is getting the fair shake. See, submission to the husband has nothing to do with shutting up and not letting your feelings be known. That's not it at all. Absolutely. That's just about the relationship. You know, if you can't talk to your mate, if you have a real difficult time, that means you're very different and very incompatible. And you have, maybe you need to go to somebody to help you learn how to talk to each other, because it's talking and telling each other what you really think and really feel that creates the relationship. That's what creates the intimacy. Okay, that's very necessary. You must use the opportunity for conflict to get to know each other, to reveal yourself to the other person. If you just shut all that down and avoid it, you never really live your life. You never really even have a relationship with that person. It's just a going through the motions again. So when we learn to speak up, and I had to learn this, I had to learn because I didn't know how to say no to people. I mean, people would say, hey, can you help me move on Saturday? I already had 3 things going on Saturday for other people. And I go, well, I'll fit it in somehow, afraid that they wouldn't like me if I said no. Finally, I realized and I learned, stood up one day and I just said, no, I can't do that. They went, okay, you know, I think I can get somebody else. I was like, wow, that was wonderful. I learned how to tell the truth. Do you have time to help me? Well, I don't have time to do that. I don't have time to do physical things for you. My spiritual gift has to do with teaching and encouraging and counseling, giving wisdom. I can help you in that way, but I don't help people in this other way, not as a rule. And so I just learned I learned boundaries that made the most out of my time. And I realized that when I did that calmly, respectfully, everybody respected that. They went, oh yeah, okay, I got it. Yeah. And so I began to be able to use my time wisely to help people with what I was sent by God to help them with. And people loved it and respected it. This is what you got to learn to do with your partner. You know, you've got to learn to be honest and truthful. You don't have to be difficult. You got to do it before you get angry. If you do it before you get angry and you just say, hey, let's talk about this. This isn't working out for me. And so you just bring it up and you put it out there. And if your partner has any kind of humility, they'll go, oh, okay, I see. Let's talk about it. Let's figure, let's work something out here. You find some middle ground that works for both of you. So you try something new. You try to deal with it a different way. Well, I'll take the garbage out, if you do the dishes, or I'll cut the grass. If you do this, or you do the clothes, and you work things out so that one person's not saddled with all the chores. That creates resentment. So this using conflict to work things out and become partners, collaborators. When you're willing to speak up about your differences when they first become apparent, before you become frustrated and resentful, we can examine the issues involved and almost always come to a compromise. Almost always. Sometimes, if you can't come to a compromise, then what's happening is that's just the symptom of a bigger root issue. And what that will do, if you're honest, God, the Spirit will lead you into that root. What is the real issue here? Because it's not this surface stuff, this circumstantial stuff. There's something deeper here that's not letting me find the middle ground. Now, what is that? That's what conflict does for you. It reveals, it exposes you. All right, so sometimes our conflicts show us that we're selfish and wrong, or that the other person is not acting out the best version of their self. Other times, issues are easily resolved by a compromise that works for both parties. Sometimes a clearer understanding of God's word, its proper application, guides the couple into healthier relating patterns if they're willing to change their hearts. Okay? Conflict is an opportunity to be honest about what you want, what you believe, what your partner wants, and what they believe, and what they're willing to do and not do, so that you know the other person, you know what they want, you know what they believe, you know how they feel, you know where they are with this, so that you can accommodate them and y'all can accommodate each other. All right. When you approach this trusting the Lord and you're willing to submit to his authority, conflict becomes a great blessing, because you're just looking for God's will. And the conflict has revealed that we're not there. We're not doing this God's way because it's not working right. And either I'm expecting too much, or I'm wanting too much, or I'm not willing to give enough, or you're not willing to give enough, or you're wanting too much. It begins to show all that, so that honest people that are truthful, that have laid down these go along to get along techniques and methods, you lay that stuff down. You don't go along to get along. That's not how you create intimacy in marriage. Intimacy has to come from being truthful, being totally truthful and honest. That takes time to open all that up. Some people are not capable of opening, or they never will. And so at some point in your relationship, you get to the end of what your partner's capable of doing, and you live with that. That's just how it works. You just live with their inability. You may have one person who's very deep and intimate, another person who's a doer and likes the details of life, and those two people have a difficult time finding middle ground. They continue to work at it. They find some way of being together, if they're married, that's gives them contentment for both of them. The Lord will bring you to that point. So when you come through conflict with the Lord, in fellowship, with wisdom in your heart, willing to lay aside the things that are wrong with you, the beliefs that don't fit God's plan, you're willing to see them and lay them aside, then you come through conflict knowing yourself, knowing your mate more deeply. You develop skills and methods of working together where you find solutions formed by a shared vision and choices. And just as we must learn to rejoice when God allows our adversities so we can grow, let us learn to embrace marital conflict as a means of growing closer to the Lord and closer to one another in marriage. Okay, so let me pray. Father, I thank you for these ideas. I pray this comes across well, and I ask it in Christ's name. Amen. All right. We'll have another lesson on submission next.